Hi, everybody. I'm Hannah from the Joseph Palombo Center, and I'm starting a series of interviews with some people associated with JPC. And the very first person we'll be interviewing is Joseph Palombo himself. Seems like the most logical place to start. Today, we'll be talking a little bit how he got into social work and kind of his relationship with the field. Yeah, so I guess my first question is, how did it all start? What got you to social work?
Well, it all started when I was in graduate school at Yale University working on a PhD in philosophy. And I had a personal crisis at that point that required that I get some help. And the person I turned to was someone in the New Haven Jewish Family Service. Um, I was fortunate in that somehow I got assigned to the executive director of that agency, a man by the name of Hoffman, whose name is indelibly inscribed in my memory. He was a social worker, and he was blind from birth. And as I sat talking with him and opening up to all that I was feeling at the time, I was so struck by his empathy, his understanding, his guidance. And he felt to me very much like a father figure. Uh, After a few sessions, I just said, hey, this is what I want to do. And I immediately uh, began exploring the possibilities. He helped guide me to that, to uh, talk to people in the social work field. And I decided at that time, the social work field was wide open in terms of the many modalities. There were child welfare agencies had social workers, prisons, and so on. But I decided what I wanted to do was to do therapy. And I applied at SSA at the University of Chicago. In contrast to today, which the younger generation today faces, at that time, I got a grant from NIH for full tuition, room and board, $200 for books a semester, which made it so easy to make the transition from being a student in one institution to the other. And so I packed up my bags and got to the University of Chicago, where I started my training.
Interestingly enough, I was also a humanities background. I got my BA in English, and then I'm also at the SSA, which stands for anyone watching who might not know what it stands for, the School of Social Service Administration at the University of Chicago. Yeah, well, I just think it's so cool that we have such a similar background. It seems very serendipitous that we ended up working together. When I saw that on your CV, I was like, oh. Okay, so we talked a little.
It enriches what we do and how we understand people to have come from a broader humanities background, and the understanding that we have about human beings.
Yeah, no, I think that's super cool. I was actually talking to Kenneth Frierson at ICSW about kind of doing work with him. And one of the things we talked about was reaching out to humanities undergrads about if they're interested in doing social work, because he also has an English degree. So it's kind of I think it's a maybe not immediately obvious, but very logical leap from humanities to social work, because they're both interested in, helping people and understanding people. Okay. Yeah. So
do you want me to talk a little bit about how I got interested in learning disabilities? Because that's another theme in my life, which really helped integrate what my childhood experiences were. So let me tell you a little bit. Um, I was born in Cairo, Egypt, and my first education was in a French school, which um, was run, by uh, Catholic Church, very strict, punitive environment. And I found that I could not learn under those circumstances. So my parents decided that I needed to change schools and transferred to an English school in Cairo. This was sort of a full immersion experience because nobody at home spoke English and I didn't know a word of English. So at the age of 10, I was placed in first grade in the English school with 6-year-olds and being taught the elements of English and trying to learn to read and write. Within a year, I had learned enough that I was promoted to the second grade, which was really with my own age group. Now, what's important about that is at the time, I did not realize that I had a fairly serious dyslexia. And part of what was problematic about my learning, especially French, which is grammatically much more complex than English, it presented an insurmountable problem. And much to my parents' distress, of course, because that was their first language. And so the shift to English really helped somehow, I think, in modern terms, helped me use a part of my brain that was more receptive to learning, both reading and writing and processing than French. And I consider now English sort of my first language, even though some people dispute that, especially when they detect my accent. And so at the time, of course, this was in the 1940s, nobody knew about dyslexia. There was a disorder called word blindness that had been identified, I think, in Germany, but nobody really knew what the cause was or how brain dysfunctions contributed to that. So I was left with sort of the mystery of why it was that I was such a slow reader, that it took me considerable time sometimes to master what I read. I learned to take copious notes, and in the process of translating from reading to writing, that helped the integration. Now, I did not realize what the problem was until much, much later. And this is where, my social work background sort of comes to the forefront. After I graduated from social work school, my first job was in a family service agency serving the west side of Chicago, a very impoverished area. So for the first 7 years, I really worked with kids from that ghetto. Some kids belonging to gangs, some kids were really suffering from poor education in families that were on welfare, a lot of poverty, a lot of suffering there. But I made the decision after a while that I wanted to be a child therapist, given that experience, because I identified with those kids, felt for their distress, and so decided that that's what I wanted to do. Now, at the time, there were no PhD programs in clinical social work. And so the avenue most people took to further their education was to go to psychoanalytic training programs. And at the time, the child therapy program, what was then called the Institute for Psychoanalysis, offered that opportunity. It required being in analysis as a prerequisite for enrollment. And I was accepted, but then found, to my distress, that the kinds of cases that the program required were not to be found in the job that I had. Engaging, kids whose social problems are so overwhelming in the kind of traditional therapy that was then offered simply did not make sense. And above all, the theoretical background, the psychoanalytic perspective, and at that time, the Oedipal complex was the dominant view of what happened in development, simply did not seem to apply to the kids that I was seeing. So I made a decision then to transfer from that job to a clinic up in the north suburbs, what's called now the Jocelyn Center. It's the Irene Jocelyn. It was founded by Irene Jocelyn as an analyst. And the fortunate thing about that was that at the time, the director of the center, Mary Giffen, was herself an analyst and specialized in children. But she had a special interest in the contribution of brain dysfunctions to kids' problems. Now, this was sort of different from the dominant view in psychoanalytic circles at the time. In psychoanalytic circles, the parents were blamed for the kids' problems. Your mother did it to you. She deprived you of the understanding. And in contrast, Mary Giffen insisted that there were other contributors. And she actually consulted with what was then called the Klawes Center, which took in kids with autism, kids with cerebral palsy, whose brain dysfunction impacted their developments and their relationships. And so as I got exposed to that and the many cases that came across the clinic and the kids that I saw, it became clear that I had a fairly substantial dyslexia that sort of got in the way of my capacity to absorb written material. Now, fortunately, that knowledge did two things. One, it impacted my work with the kids, and secondly, it had a large impact on how I approached my learning disability. The shift in the treatment of the kids was that I sort of got on a campaign of not blaming the parents for the kids' problems, but saying that the kids' problems caused the family disruptions. And it was the reverse of what people thought. The other, it helped me somehow compensate for my dyslexia, understanding that somehow removed an emotional barrier to the material. And so, I became an avid reader and found that, I could absorb much more once the emotional barrier to the, that was there from prior experiences was removed. And that set the course of the rest of my career, actually, with my interest in the broader brain dysfunctions, the other learning disabilities, and how they contribute to people's development, to their problems, and also to what we do in therapy with those patients.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting for me. The more and more I talk to social workers or people in the field, the more I learn that people are almost always grounded in, if not their own personal experience, then their family's experience or their friend's experience. And that's kind of a big part of the reason that they pursued the field. And I think that's makes a lot of sense considering it's a field that is like predicated on empathy and, you know, understanding people. And if you're understanding and empathizing from the inside, that makes a lot of sense why you'd end up where you ended up. I guess my next question that I've been thinking about while you're talking is, because you've been in the field for so long, how has the field changed, both in positive and negative ways? And what's different in 2020 than it was when you first started?
Uh,
I mean, a
uh,
lot of things, obviously, but just like a bullet point.
yes. SSA at the time, we're talking about 1957, 58, when I was there. The main focus of the program was what was then called, ego psychology, and it was psychoanalytic. All the instructors were essentially um, sort of subscribed to that theoretical framework. Um, the, the tension there was that what psychoanalysis was offering did not quite fit in with the elements of social justice that we think about today, the elements of how you translate, one-to-one therapy to work in communities that are disrupted, deprived, or other populations. So that what was then called psychiatric social work, that was the term that was used in terms of identifying what we did, had a very narrow applicability to the populations that social workers were seeing. So as time went on, and we're talking now in the early 60s, there began to be a disillusionment in what psychoanalysis could offer, right? And with the women's movement, especially in the 60s and early 70s, what came about was a rejection of Freud, and his view of women, and his sort of, we used to joke about how he misunderstood women completely. Women were really castrated men in his view. So the field was changing in that respect, which those of us who had been trained in the psychodynamic perspective really were distressed about, because we felt that what we did with patients was helpful to those patients. So that we struggled with how to reconcile what we were doing with the changes that were occurring. And places like SSA, where I taught for several years at SSA, I taught the child treatment course at SSA for several years. It was a very popular course with students. And then we sort of parted ways. And I stopped teaching there. Just to interject something, because that was part of the shift in my career, which was that once I finished the child therapy program, the director of the program was retiring, and I was asked to be the director. So I became the director of the child therapy program, and I began teaching essentially more of the psychodynamic and psychoanalytic theories that were the dominant ones. We're talking now about um, 1970, early 1980. Now, several threads converged after I left the child therapy program. And what came about was that social workers who then became identified as clinical social workers began to feel the need for an advanced degree in clinical social work, which existed only at Smith College. Smith was the only place that offered a PhD in clinical social work. Then in California, the clinical society there established the California Institute for Clinical Social Work. Now, at the time, I was commuting in the summers to California to teach there. I became friends with the people who were at the California Institute who ran it. I gave the first convocation speech for their first graduates there. And then when I came back here, a colleague, Arnie Levin, who was the head of the clinical society, and I thought, well, it's time for us to start a PhD program here of our own. And so with that, we began to work to put together what became ICSW. So when you ask about how did the field shift, there was first sort of a tsunami against psychoanalytic thinking in the schools of social work. And there was the counter movement that we brought as clinicians, insisting that there was some value, but with some theoretical modifications, so that it was no longer Freud that we sort of worshipped, but rather some of the other approaches. And of course, Mitchell offered the relational approach, and Kohut then brought in, self-psychology, which incidentally, I was at the Institute for Psychoanalysis when Kohut first published his work. So, he and I knew each other, and he invited me to the workshop that he conducted. So I learned a lot from him and carried with me much of what he offered in self-psychology. So what I'm trying to say essentially is that academia, and especially the Council on Social Work Educations, really devalued the psychodynamic framework. Yet we as clinicians found that what we did was of great value. Okay. So with that, I think there's been a convergence between what happens in our institute, in the ICSW, and what happens in academia, with some modifications. I think some schools still retain some psychoanalytic courses. I think the students, the fieldwork students, are exposed more to a psychodynamic approach where they work. Just to pull this to conclude, where things stand now is that in terms of the social work field, I think there isn't a central framework to which, quote, clinical social workers subscribe. when I used to teach the course on paradigms, there are now about 6 major psychodynamic paradigms, and you sort of are exposed to each of them, and you pick and choose, whether it's relational theory, whether it's object relations, whether it's the interpersonal perspective. And as I'll be teaching later today, attachment theory is one of the dominant paradigms, which is psychodynamic.
Yeah, I can only really speak for SSA, but I know that you're kind of offered a lot of different modalities and a lot of different theories. And as a clinician, you get to kind of pick and choose like what makes the most sense to you and what, you kind of want to emphasize in your own practice. Yeah, no, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but my sense of it is that SSA at least, and maybe more the field in general, has kind of warmed back up to the type of theory that you're talking about, when it seems like you kind of parted ways, and now they're kind of coming back a little bit. Would you say that's accurate?
Well, I think I'm not so familiar anymore with what the offerings are at SSA, but my sense is that there is a significant number of applicants, students, who want to become clinicians, and either because they themselves have been in therapy and have had that experience, or for other reasons, are hungry for that kind of training. So that the pressure is coming, I think, from the students rather than from the faculty. I'm no longer familiar with the faculty there. I used to know most of the teachers there, but my sense is even at Loyola, there is a strong desire on the part of students who want to be clinicians to get that kind of training.
Yeah, I think I get the same sense. And then in addition to that, at SSA, again, there's been a really big push from the student population to really focus on social justice,
Right.
which I personally found very refreshing in my classes thus far, how much we've talked about social justice and how much that's an emphasis, because I think that's often missing from social work fields. I sometimes get the sense that there is this assumption, if you're a social worker, that you're the good guy, which means that you can do no wrong, when reality is that social workers can do just as much harm as any other fields, and kind of the self-awareness and reflexivity is really important from the get-go.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I guess the next question I was thinking about is, what advice do you have for future social workers? As someone who is going to be a future social worker, I am very curious.
Well, I think what people who want to go into the field are faced with now is how to bring together what is of value in the psychodynamic approach, what we have been familiar with, what I have been familiar with in terms of attachment theory, and the applicability of that to a much broader group than currently is applied. We need to think about ways of translating all of this to the underserved, to people who suffer serious deprivations. In other words, I'm looking at the tension between the social justice movement, the Black Lives movement, and the problems that they face, and those of us who traditionally have been working out of our offices offering individual treatment. So how to bring what we offer and what we know into the broader community and applying that, that is the challenge. Now, if I can put in a good word for my center, I think that the current director, Bill Gieske, sent me an email with a program where we can offer what we know about human development, about attachment theory, about the causes of certain dysfunctions like learning disabilities, to social agencies, for example, that offer services to children like foster care, where the need is so great to help foster parents understand the kids and avoid problems. There is a large community out there that can benefit from what we have learned about human development, and especially about the contribution of brain dysfunctions to that. There are a lot of kids who have been exposed to lead with, the lead paint, which has affected their developments. We know a lot about fetal alcohol syndromes and the causes of that. So we have something to offer that reconciles then the tension between, offering individual therapy, which may change one or two people, to the broader community where we can reach many, many more. So this is really where I see opportunities for students, to somehow get in both camps and work to bring those two together.
Yeah, as someone who right now, my intended career path is to do individual therapy, that's something that I've been thinking about a lot because I certainly identify with the social justice movement. And I have been thinking about a lot, like, how do you incorporate that teaching and that awareness into individual therapy? Because like you said, it's a little less obvious what the application is than if you're working for, a nonprofit, or you're working for CPS or something like that. Yeah, interesting. Let me see if I want to ask another question. I think those were my main questions. Is there anything else that you feel like you want to say, or what's kind of a wrapping up thing that you feel like you can offer to people watching this video?
Well, I can't resist but think about the context in which we're living, of a polarized society, of divergent views of the values that people have in terms of how to address social needs. The tension there is fundamentally between a view that says we as communities are interdependent. We need each other, and we need to care for each other in ways that, even if they require personal sacrifices, we ought to make those. On the other side, there are those who believe that, you as individuals are responsible for your own lives, and it's up to you to make what you can out of emphasizing individuality and emphasizing sort of what they might call initiative as a primary value, and independence sort of from being supported by others as being a primary value. So right now, our society is fairly divided in those two views, and there seems to be no middle ground between them, which is problematic. And so I would hope that somehow a shift can occur, but I'm not very optimistic about that.
Sure, yeah. For context of people watching this, we are recording this video before the election has been called. So in this conversation, we are not sure if Donald Trump or Joe Biden will be president. And I think I'm really glad you brought this up because I think it's very timely. And then also, I've been thinking about right now, it looks pretty good for Joe Biden, fingers crossed. But even if Joe Biden does win, I'm really hoping that people won't get complacent because Joe Biden certainly has some trouble in his policies and his intended work. Certainly better than Trump. Not gonna, try to change that, but I think it's really important for, the social justice movement to remain just as strong as it's been in the last year, and especially for us white folks to really keep pushing and really keep doing the work, because it's easy to get complacent and it's easy to get tired.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so I guess we'll finish up here. Thank you so much for talking with me for a while here. As far as you listeners, viewers, what you can expect to come next is Joe and I are planning on doing some similar to this videos, talking about different things in the field, maybe some articles or some research. Not exactly sure what that'll look like yet, but you can expect more content from us. So yeah, I'm gonna end the recording now, but it was nice to see everyone virtually. Thanks for talking to me.